Not every grief comes with a funeral, and not every love survives silence. Some wars, my dear, don't leave blood, but leave behind legacies no one dares to open. My name is Geraldine Brooks Monroe. No one calls me that these days. Here at the nursing home in Vermont, I'm just the lady in the room with the stained glass window, the one who spends her afternoons watching the rain tap against the glass, like she's waiting for something. And maybe I am. I'm 90 years old, and I carry a secret that's aged with me. A secret I've held since the days I wore that uniform, with the white scarf tied around my neck, crossing the damp fields of England in air evacuation trucks. I was a nurse, the kind who wiped blood with trembling hands but said, "You'll be fine," with steady eyes. That was war. That was life. That was everything, all at once. What I'm about to tell you isn't a typical war story. It's a story of love and silence, of choices and losses, of a man who touched my soul and left without knowing he'd left something inside me, something that grew, something that lived without a father's name. So before time steals even my memory, I want to ask you to stay with me. Sit here in this imaginary armchair. Take a deep breath. Close your eyes and listen with your heart open. If this story moves you, and I know it will, like the video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to the channel. Because some stories aren't meant to be forgotten. There are days that feel ordinary, but without warning, split your life into before and after. For me, it was a Tuesday. Gray skies, the smell of burnt toast coming from the mess hall window, and a yellowed piece of paper with my name scribbled crooked in the top corner. You learn over time that not every calling shouts. Some whisper, and still change everything. I was just another nurse with crooked boots and a notebook full of abbreviations only I could read. I'd been spending night after night tending to boys, whose eyes were bigger than their wounds. Some had names like flowers, William Rose, Johnny Bloom. Others were just numbers on a clipboard, bleeding more than any child should. War didn't choose gently, but I did choose where to place my hands first. That was my tiny act of resistance, to heal what still had a heartbeat. That morning, the commander walked into the barracks with a look that made my stomach twist. It wasn't anger or urgency. It was the kind of look that comes when a decision's already been made. She sat on the edge of my bed, smoothed out the stiff sheet, and said with no ceremony at all, "Monroe, you've been assigned to air evacuation. You leave in 2 days for the base in Lincolnshire." I froze. Air evacuation? That wasn't for just anyone. That was for those who could handle seeing war in the sky and on the ground. For those who could inject morphine with one hand and hold back vomit with the other. I knew exactly what it meant. It was war, airborne. Planes picking up human wreckage from the front lines and flying it back to wherever there were still beds and medicine. But what nobody knew, not even me, really, was that I wanted to leave. Not out of bravery, not for patriotism. I wanted to go because staying in my town hurt more than leaving it. Every time I opened the door to my great-aunt's house, where I'd lived since my mother died, the emptiness met me like an old ghost. The war had been a convenient excuse. My enlistment wasn't heroic. It was an escape from guilt, from the past, and more than anything, from a heart that never properly healed. 2 days later, there I was, sitting in a gray truck, duffel bag at my feet, and an envelope sewn into my bra, hiding the last letter from a boy named Raymond, a name no one mentioned anymore, a name I pretended not to hear any time someone called another soldier with the same initial. The ride to the airbase felt endless, and I didn't know it then, but that dirt road would be the last stretch of American soil I'd touch for many years. When I stepped off the truck, I felt the sharp cold of a war-worn England. The bare branches of the trees looked like dry hands reaching upward, and the wind whistled like it knew something I didn't. It felt like stepping into a place that had no tolerance for distraction. The first thing they taught us there was, don't get attached. Not to patients, not to fellow nurses, not to hope. Everything was temporary. Everything was disposable, even pain. That first night, I couldn't sleep. The bed creaked, rats scurried under the lockers, and the light bulb flickered like it too. Couldn't bear the weight of war. I pulled out my notebook and wrote a sentence I've never forgotten. If I disappear here, I hope someone finds this page and knows that, at least I loved. It felt strange to think about love in the middle of uniforms, syringes, and shouted orders. But the truth is, people think war is all bombs and gunpowder. It's not. Real war is made of silences, of waiting, of eyes that say, please save me, and hands that hold yours for 5 seconds before letting go forever. On my first flights, I saw things I've never even told the mirror. Bodies still breathing but unaware they were alive. Boys who smelled of milk screaming for their mothers as the plane took off. One of them, I remember so clearly, said, "Ma'am, if I die now, can you tell my sister I loved her cake?" I just nodded, but I never forgot. No one talks about that part. They only tell the bits about bullets and flags. But the real war, my daughter, was surviving what we saw with our eyes and what we felt with our hearts. And me? I just kept surviving, one flight at a time, one swallowed tear at a time, until one day he stepped onto the plane. But that part, I'll tell you in just a little while. Most men arrived with war written all over their faces, dirt under their nails, gunpowder on their breath, and a certain hardness in their eyes, like something inside them had turned to stone. I could spot that look from a mile away, a nameless exhaustion, a quiet kind of giving up. Some screamed on the plane, others shook. Most just went silent. It was always the same, always, until him. I remember it like it was happening now. Late afternoon, and the sky had that faded color of old paper, like the world had been washed too many times. The plane landed rougher than usual, and the pilot warned us they had an unstable casualty on board, possible internal bleeding. We ran, like we always did. But when I opened the door and saw him sitting there, wounded, pale, I just knew. You know when time folds in on itself? That's what it felt like. A moment where everything around me blurred. His skin was deep like freshly polished bronze, hair shaved close to the scalp, and his face, calm. Too calm for someone just dragged out of a battlefield. His arm was bandaged, shirt torn, chest heaving. But those eyes, oh, those eyes. Eyes of someone who'd already seen the end and chosen to keep going. He looked straight at me for 2 seconds and smiled. A crooked smile like he knew smiling in a war zone was borderline blasphemy, but did it anyway, like he was letting himself live for 1 second. "Are you the miracle nurse?" he asked, voice raspy. I couldn't answer. I just moved him onto the stretcher with a strange tightness in my chest. It wasn't fear. It wasn't desire. It was something else. Something old. Something that felt like it had been waiting for me a long time. On the way, he told me his name. James Eli Turner, from Chicago. Said he'd been a gunner in a bomber squad, but mostly he just sang for the guys before missions. Said he sang blues. Said the music made the planes shake less. The noise of war never scared me as much as the silence that came after the gunfire. He said, eyes fixed on the plane's ceiling. That hit me in a place I didn't even know I had, because I feared that silence too. The silence after the scream, after the goodbye, after the last breath. He stayed in the infirmary for a few days. I cared for him without drawing attention, not because I didn't want to, but because around there, everything was watched. A black nurse and a black soldier, laughing too much, sitting too close, looking too long. It was dangerous, not because of the obvious, but because of the whispers, the way some folks curled their lips without saying a word. War had its own silent codes, too. Still, he kept trying, cracking jokes, making faces when I changed his bandages. And one morning, he left a small dried flower folded inside my notebook. Along with it, a piece of paper that read, "If the war really has to take everything from us, let it take it all, except this moment." I cried hidden behind the sheet storage room. They taught us not to get attached in that base, not to grow roots. But with James, it was like trying to hold water in my hands. No matter how hard I tried to keep distance, he kept slipping into my thoughts during the quietest hours. There was a day, rainy of course, when I walked into the mess hall and saw him sitting alone, fiddling with what looked like a journal. When he saw me, he pointed to the seat beside him and said, "Geraldine, do you believe that some people only show up once in your life, and when they do, you just know you'll never forget them?" I didn't know what to say, so I sat down, and we ate in silence, and it was the fullest silence I've ever felt. James didn't seem like he belonged in war. He felt like he came from before, from a time when people looked each other in the eyes without fear, when loving someone wasn't risking punishment, or exile, or erasure. He felt like he came from a world that still believed in letters and holding hands. But war doesn't forgive beauty, or softness. It shatters whatever is delicate and throws it down like cracked porcelain. And that's exactly why, that night, I knew. If I didn't say anything, if I left things as they were, he'd leave. Be sent to another base, another mission, another gray sky, and I'd never see him again. So I went to him, knees trembling, fingers sweaty, heart about to burst out of my chest. I didn't say a word. I just sat beside him, touched his hand, and let him understand. He understood. And what happened next, you already suspect. But no, it wasn't what you think. It wasn't some quick wartime fling. It wasn't a fever dream. It was something else, something sacred. A meeting of two souls that recognized each other in the middle of destruction. A beautiful story that didn't last long, but never left me. The next morning he was called to an evacuation mission on the farthest front in Normandy. He said goodbye with a kiss on the back of my hand, and he whispered, "Keep this with you, whatever it is." I did, silently, and I waited for him for days, until a plane came back. But he wasn't among the wounded, or the living. But that part I'll tell you later. I've always believed that some nights outlive us, nights that linger, that keep on existing somewhere invisible in time, playing on repeat like a scratched record. The night James left was one of those, a frozen fragment of the world that never thawed. I can still hear it, if I focus hard enough, like it's hiding behind the sound of the rain outside, peeking through the leaks in the stained glass of my window. There was no warning, no ceremony, just silence. That morning started like all the others, a line of wounded soldiers, trays with stale bread, quick orders over the loudspeaker. I hid behind my routine like it was a shield. Every syringe, every gauze pad, every stitch was an attempt to forget that the day before had been anything but routine. But my hand still trembled, not from fear, from memory, because the night before, James and I said nothing, and still said everything. It was one of those rare moments when love doesn't need to be named, just a fingertips touch, the silence between two breaths, The way someone's eyes stay on your face a second too long. It was there, in the little back room of the infirmary, while the storm cracked like bones outside, that we stopped the war for a moment. There were no promises, no urgency. It was a quiet kind of love. Tired, afraid it wouldn't last long, but willing to exist anyway. He told me about his younger sister who was taking care of their sick mother in Chicago. Said he always dreamed of opening a bookstore with a piano in the back, where people could pick out books while someone played something soft. I smiled, told him I wanted a house with a wooden porch, where I could spend my afternoons stitching embroidery and listening to children playing in the distance, and he said that, if he came back, he'd build that for me. But we didn't say, if I come back. We didn't say, wait for me. We just stayed there, breathing together. His body against mine, his head resting on my lap, like that tiny corner of the world was the only place where anything made sense. A nurse, a gunner, 2 temporary souls, a war story inside a bigger one. In the early hours, the rain grew heavier. There was something in the sound of that storm that felt like a warning, like the sky was trying to speak without words. I stood up slowly, adjusted the scarf around my neck, and covered James with one of the thin barrack blankets. He was asleep, or pretending. Maybe that was the only way for us to say goodbye without breaking what we had. I went back to my room with a chest full of silence. The next day, I didn't see him at breakfast, or in the infirmary. A fellow nurse whispered, "He was called to the advanced evac line." The colonel needed someone he could trust. I didn't cry. I didn't ask for details. I just went back to my post like always. But that day dragged on like a wounded soldier. And time in that base was cruel. When it dragged, it meant it was about to swallow someone whole. That night, a windstorm hit the base hard. Light posts swayed. Uniforms on the line flew like ownerless bodies. A plane landed in the dark, stumbling down hard. There was blood on the ground before the wheels even touched. We ran, like always, with trays of morphine, flashlights, and dry mouths. But he wasn't among the ones who came down. I waited. I waited until every last body was pulled out. Until every form was stamped. Until names were called in hushed tones down the hallway like they were summoning ghosts. But I didn't hear James Eli Turner. The next morning I went looking for his journal, the one with crooked thoughts and dried flowers tucked inside. It wasn't in the drawer, not under the mattress either. A nurse, eyes lowered, simply said, "The aircraft crashed. Only 2 made it out. He wasn't one of them." I felt the base spin around me. The alarm bells seemed to be going off inside my chest. The war suddenly got personal. I stood there frozen like a stake in the ground, and the world passed me by like smoke. I went back to my room, pulled the curtain shut, took off the scarf from around my neck and left it on the bed. And then, for the first time in months, I cried myself to sleep. Cried as if every tear were an unsent letter, saying everything I'd never dared to say. The war story everyone else told was about victory, territory, numbers. Mine was made of absence, of a love no one ever saw, of a beautiful story that lived entirely in the space between 2 flights. The following week, someone handed me a package, a wrinkled envelope with my name handwritten on it. Inside there was a folded sheet of paper, the handwriting shaky. It was from him. "Geraldine, if anything happens, I want you to know that for one night, I lived outside the war. And if that's the only memory I leave behind, then it was enough. Signed J.E.T." I folded the paper carefully, sewed it into the lining of my uniform, and never told a soul, not once, until now. Some words die before they're ever born. Others die along the way. The letter I wrote to James was one of those, a beautiful story that never reached the one who inspired it. Sometimes I wonder if it got lost in some muddy field, forgotten in a pile of military paperwork, or simply swallowed by the world, like so many other truths the war refused to carry. It took me 2 days to sit down and write it. 2 whole days, with trembling hands and a mind drowning in memories that wouldn't line up, as if my body still hoped it was all a mistake, that someone would walk into the infirmary and say, "Wrong report. He made it. He's coming back." But war doesn't undo mistakes. It repeats them. On the 3rd night, with rain tapping on the tin roof and a candle flickering in the corner of the desk, I finally began to write. I took a sheet of paper with frayed edges, the last one in the folder I kept hidden under my mattress, and started like this. "James, I don't know if this letter will ever reach you, but I need to write it anyway, because some part of me still believes that a spoken word, even if never heard, turns into something. And I need to become something that survives the silence." In the letter, I told him how much he had been a shelter in a field full of wreckage. I wrote about his crooked smile and our whispered conversations between shift changes. I said he had hands that seemed to remember who they touched, and that was rare. So rare in a place like that. But I didn't mention the suspicion already growing inside me. I didn't talk about the nausea, or the missed cycle, or the feeling that woke me each morning like a silent drum, because that letter was still about love, and love, when it's grieving, doesn't know how to be practical. It just wants to remember. At the end, I wrote, "If we never see each other again in this world, know that the little we had was enough to give me a reason to come back alive. And I will come back, even if just for you, even if just for me." I signed it with just the first letter of my name, because I was afraid someone might intercept it, because I already knew the kind of looks people gave in the halls, and because it had always been my way to hide. The next day, I slipped the envelope into the outgoing military mail. I handed it directly to an older nurse who sorted everything by hand. She had thin fingers and always wore a hairpin shaped like a flower. I remember the way she looked at me. "Where's it going?" she asked without looking up. "Chicago. Family of Soldier Turner. You can mark it personal." She nodded. But her eyes said something else. A long pause, an arched brow full of questions she'd never ask. I just looked away. I never got confirmation, never a reply. And over time, I started to suspect that letter never left the base. Maybe she read it. Maybe she judged it improper. Maybe she tore it up. Or maybe she tucked it into an envelope with other truths the war found too inconvenient to let circulate. Because war didn't like love stories. It dismantled them like broken toys. It accepted courage, obedience, silence, but not love, especially not the love between a black nurse and a black gunner, 2 people who dared to exist with dignity in a world that screamed at us not to feel anything at all. Months later, I got mail from a generic address in Illinois. I opened it with sweaty hands, but it was just an administrative form from the air mission. No note, no message, nothing. And so, inside, I accepted that the letter I wrote never made it. Accepted that he left, carrying only what he could hold from that last night. And maybe that was enough. But it was in that space between what was never said and what was never heard that something began to grow inside me. Something small, invisible, persistent. The same nausea that kept me from drinking coffee. The same hand now resting over my belly with fear and reverence. The same secret that had begun to nest under my apron. Back then there were no instant tests, but I knew. Every woman knows. And his absence became even more present. The war story I was living was no longer about air evacuations or nameless soldiers. It had become a tender story about everything I never said, and everything he never knew. And the letter I wrote stayed with me, even though he didn't, because some words, even when they never arrive, still echo. Life has a strange way of letting us know when something's about to change. It doesn't always come with signs. Sometimes it's just a wave of nausea that keeps coming back. Sometimes it's a sound from your body you've never heard before. Sometimes it's the way your hand keeps drifting to your belly without even realizing, as if something inside you is asking to be noticed. That's how it was for me. I woke up one morning with a metallic taste in my mouth. It wasn't blood, but it felt like it. I sat slowly on the edge of the bed, feet pressing against the cold floor, waiting for the world to stop spinning. On the wall, a crucifix swung gently with the wind coming through the window. And in that quiet morning, I knew. It wasn't war. It wasn't grief. It was life inside me. For a moment, I felt like I was betraying death. On that base, everything revolved around loss, around wounds, around bleeding that wouldn't stop. And now, my body decided to bloom, in secret. As if whispering, while you destroy, I continue to create. But I shook, because a child wasn't just a blessing. It was a responsibility of time and space. It needed a name, safety, a story of where it came from. And I had nothing but memories and a letter that never arrived. I tried to deny it, for weeks, convinced myself it was something else. A hormonal glitch, stress, bad food, the weather. Anything but what I already knew. But the body is wise, and it kept changing. My breasts felt heavier, my breath shorter. The world smelled different, and I couldn't stand the scent of fresh blood or antiseptic anymore. Things that had once been part of my daily routine now made me nauseous. The war story around me kept marching at its usual pace. But inside, another kind of battle had begun. Then one cloudy afternoon, while folding sheets in the supply room, I felt it. A light flutter low in my belly, like a feather brushing from the inside. A butterfly wing beating just beneath my navel. I touched my stomach, startled, and laughed. So, you really are there. It was the first time I spoke to him. To her. To whoever was growing in there. That night I wrote again. Not to James this time, but to myself. I grabbed my notebook and wrote on the last page. If I die, I want someone to know. I don't regret it. Even if he never finds out. Even if the world doesn't accept it. Even if my name fades into nothing. I wrote it and folded the notebook like sealing a will. Because now I carried two wars. The one outside and the one inside. There were days I thought of telling someone. The other nurses, the head matron. But something always stopped me. Fear, shame, instinct. Because back then being an unmarried pregnant woman meant being erased. And if that woman was black, the erasure was doubled. There would be pointing fingers, whispers in the halls, forced transfers. Or worse, the quiet directive to take care of it discreetly. So I stayed quiet. I wore my apron each day like armor, put on pale lipstick like I was painting strength on my face, and smiled. Smiled so no one would suspect. So I could keep being the reliable nurse, the one who doesn't shake, the one who handles everything. But inside, the silence screamed. One morning I nearly fainted. A sergeant saw me, raised an eyebrow, and suggested rest. I said it was anemia, burnout, anything that sounded more acceptable than the truth. That's when the rumors started. One nurse, with a thick accent and cold eyes, said I was too quiet, too slow. Another, older one, asked if I was eating enough. The nurse with the flower clip in her hair, the same one from the letter, passed by and muttered under her breath, "Black woman, pregnant in a war zone. Watch your back. Some mouths don't forgive." That was the only warning I got. And it was enough. I knew what was coming. The following week, I was summoned to the medical director's office. That wasn't common. I walked in with my heart pounding, palms sweaty under my gloves. A captain in a white coat, with scruffy beard and pale blue eyes, stared at me blankly. "We received a transfer request. There's a mission that needs a nurse with your qualifications. But before that, you'll go through a medical evaluation." That wasn't a suggestion. It was a command in disguise. I smiled, thanked him, accepted. They sent me to a small convent far from the front lines, a place where women like me were sent for rest, recovery, or to give birth far from the eyes of the world. And just like that, no confession, no paperwork, no one really knowing, I left the base. The war story that had begun with syringes and airplanes now wandered down stone corridors lit by candles, where nuns spoke little and the rooms smelled of lavender and prayer. There, time stood still. My body could finally show what it had been hiding, and with that came fear. What if I don't survive? What if the world doesn't want him? What if I'm not enough? But tenderness came too. A nun with warm hands told me every day, every life, even the quietest one, is a miracle that insists on being. And so I held on, because now I wasn't just a nurse. I was shelter. I was home. I was the living memory of a man who died never knowing he left behind more than just absence. And even if he never knew, I knew. The convent I ended up in felt suspended in time. Thick stone walls held an ancient silence, and everything there smelled of wax and prayer. There were no sirens, no rushed footsteps like at the airbase. Time there moved with the slow sway of a bell in the wind. I walked the halls with my hands pressed to my lower back, my body growing rounder by the day, and my heart trapped in a constant state of waiting. The nuns were polite but distant, except for one, Sister Agnes, a small woman with grey hair tied in a low bun and a voice that sounded like it had known too many secrets to judge anything. She was the one who treated me like I was made of glass. She brought me bitter herbal teas, tucked me in on cold nights, and once, when she saw me sitting alone in the back garden with tearful eyes, she said, "You don't need to understand everything right now. You just need not to give up." The days were monotonous, but what was growing inside me wasn't. Each week brought something new, a stronger movement, a new ache in my back, an emotion that caught me off guard while I washed my face. Some nights I'd wake up and press my hands to my belly like I could shield what the world didn't yet know existed. There were no ultrasounds, no regular checkups, no one to tell me whether it was a boy or girl. But I felt it, the way only mothers do. It was a boy, and he wasn't just life. He was legacy. He was the final page of a story that never got to be written by two, and he was also the beginning of one I'd have to tell alone. He was born on a grey morning, with the sound of bells and the scent of boiled sheets in the air. There was no anesthesia, no comforting words, just sweat pouring down my head and face, contractions tearing me in half, and Sister Agnes whispering, "He's almost here, sweetheart. Just a little more." When he was born, he didn't cry right away. There was a long, sharp silence that cut through my chest like a blade. And then finally, sound. A loud cry, a new sound in the world. And my body, once hardened by everything, melted completely. I cried with him as if, together, we were making up for the absence of the one who wasn't there. They wrapped him in an embroidered white cloth and placed him in my arms. He was small and warm, with James's nose in my mouth. His eyes were still shut, but I knew that when he opened them, I'd see a longing he couldn't yet understand. They didn't let me keep him long. Said I needed to rest, that the baby had to be taken to the nursery. I didn't resist. I'd already learned that, in this war, obedience was a form of survival. But before they took him, I whispered in his ear, "Your father was made of music, and you, my son, you are the song that stayed." In the days that followed, I drifted between delirium and exhaustion. Sometimes I heard him cry from afar. Other times I thought I was dreaming. The nuns kept me in bed, and Sister Agnes came every night to tell me he was fine, that he'd fed well, that he slept with his fists clenched like he was holding on to something he didn't want to lose. When they finally let me see him again, I was hit with a strange mix of familiarity and awe, like I'd known him forever but was just now discovering him for real. I gave him a name I never registered, a name I kept only for myself, Elijah. The name James once said he'd give a son, if he ever had one. "Elijah sounds like hope," he said. And in that cold room with the thin mattress, crucifix on the wall, and torn curtain in the window, I repeated the name until he fell asleep in my arms. We didn't stay long. The war was closing in, and the convent couldn't keep women and babies for too long. One afternoon, a nun came to me and said they were arranging my return to America. They gave me clean clothes, a hand-stamped military travel pass, and a small cardboard box. Inside were a few glass bottles, 2 embroidered blankets, and an old photo of the Virgin Mary with a handwritten note. "Return whole, even if in pieces." I took my son, now bundled in a navy blue blanket, and climbed into the truck that would take us to the port. On the way, I looked at the bare trees, the damp fields, the skies heavy with memory, and I thought, he was born on foreign soil, but he is made of everything most sacred in me. The ship rocked hard, in the cargo hold where mothers with young children stayed. The air was thick with milk and nausea. I held Elijah close to my chest, humming softly a lullaby my grandmother used to sing to me when I was little. Some women looked at me with curiosity, others with veiled disdain. One lady with pale eyes and a headscarf came up and asked if the baby's father was military too. I just answered, he was good. And she, as if she understood, didn't ask again. The days at sea were long. The war story now felt far away, but still hovered around me like mist. I saw in the faces of the other women the same emptiness that lived in mine. Many were returning with less than they'd brought. I was returning with more, but no one seemed to see it. When we docked on American soil, I held Elijah tight. The scent of the land felt ancient, and for the first time I felt real fear. Because in this country that claimed to be mine, I knew my son would face wars without bombs. Wars of stares, of questions, of doors quietly closed. And I would need to stay alive long enough to protect him from all the things that couldn't protect his father. They took me to a temporary shelter. There I reunited with other nurses who had gone through similar things, though few spoke about it. Pain made us quiet. Elijah grew between midnight cries and sudden laughter. He had curious eyes and restless hands. It was as if he already knew he had arrived through twisted paths, but wasn't scared of them. I, on the other hand, feared everything. Feared not being enough. Feared not knowing how to answer when he asked about his father. Feared not being able to be two things at once, a mother and a silence. But every time he looked at me and smiled with that mouth that was James's, I knew he was my home, and with him in my arms I would never be alone again. I carried that box like someone carries a body, with reverence, with fear, with the feeling that it weighed more than the whole world. It was a simple box, brown, dented at the corners, tied shut with a strip of hospital tape. Sister Agnes handed it to me on the day I left. She only said, "It's what we managed to save." I knew what was inside, even without looking. And that's exactly why. I didn't open it. During the crossing, I slept with it at the foot of my canvas bed, kept it beneath the seat on deck, held it in my lap while nursing Elijah with trembling hands. That box was my reliquary, my altar, my secret wrapped in cardboard. I was afraid that if I opened it, everything holding me together would fall apart, as if the objects inside were too much proof of what reality kept trying to erase, that it had all happened, that James had existed, and that our love, even if brief, had been made of flesh, paper, and photograph. When I disembarked, they sent me to a women's shelter in South Philadelphia, an old mansion with locked windows and worn carpet. There, single mothers didn't ask each other questions. It was the kind of shared silence that hurt, but protected. Elijah cried a lot those first nights, and I, not knowing what else to do, spent hours rocking him with my eyes fixed on the ceiling, imagining what it would be like if James could see him. Sometimes I whispered, "He has your nose, your brow, and that way of curling his mouth when he's upset," as if saying it out loud would keep James's memory alive, even in his absence. It wasn't until the third week that I placed the box on my lap with the intent to open it. I waited for Elijah to fall asleep. The other women were quiet. The floor creaked with the wind, and the sound of rain hit the roof like an old memory knocking. It was nighttime, and I needed to face whatever was inside. With sweaty hands, I untied the tape. The lid creaked as I lifted it, like it didn't want to give up its secrets. The first item was James's pin, the one he wore on his collar when he wasn't in uniform. It was small, bird-shaped, made of brass, still held a faint scent of cologne mixed with dried sweat from long marches. I pressed it to my lips without thinking, like it was something holy. Then, a letter. Not the one I had written, but one from him, scribbled, unfinished, a draft. "Geraldine, I wanted to tell you that." And then nothing. A line, a crease, a pause that never ended. I tucked it away without reading further. Silence was an answer too. And finally, the photograph. The same one he'd once handed me, folded in four, saying, "Don't show it to anyone. Just keep it." It was a blurry image, him smiling sideways in a field, with shadows of other soldiers behind him. It was faded, but I could still see the light in his eyes. I laid it against my chest. I didn't cry. There were no more tears left, just a tightness in my body, as if it had finally accepted that James wasn't coming back, that the man in the photo would never see the sun growing each day in my arms. I packed everything back up, even more carefully than before. The box was closed again, and from that moment on it became part of our room, like a piece of furniture, like a living memory Elijah hadn't yet learned to name. Sometimes he'd crawl over to it, pat the top with his tiny hands and smile. I would just say, "It's your daddy's." And he, as if he understood, would rest his head there and doze off. When we moved to a small back room in a boarding house in rural New Jersey, the box was the first thing I placed on the highest shelf. I didn't want anyone to touch it. I didn't want anyone to ask. Sometimes I'd take it down and hug it in the dark, like I was holding James himself, like it gave me permission to remember. Years passed. Elijah grew, and I reinvented myself as best I could. I took in mending, cleaned houses, washed other people's laundry. My nursing degree slept in a folder, along with papers that proved, yes, I had served, that I had cared for lives in wobbling plains and muddy fields. But no one cared about that. The world only saw a black woman with a child who had almond eyes and thick curls. And the questions always came. Where's the father from? Went off to war and didn't come back? You two marry at the courthouse? I learned to answer softly, with steady eyes. I learned to protect Elijah with vague stories and constant affection. But inside, the truth never slept. It lived in that box, and it watched me. When Elijah turned 5, he asked for the first time, "Mommy, how come I don't have a daddy like the other boys at school?" I froze. He was lying on his stomach, drawing on the floor with crayons. My heart raced. I thought about lying, thought about inventing a hero, but all I could say was, "You do. He just became a star before he got to play with you." He stayed quiet. Then after a while he said, "Okay. One day I'll look up at the sky and tell him I'm okay." It broke me and mended me all at once, because even without knowing, he understood. The box stayed there for years, untouched, but never gone. And me? I kept going, one day at a time, feeding my son with soup and memory, with forehead kisses and made-up stories, with silence and tenderness, until one day he was big enough to climb the shelf and take the box down with his own hands. But that's another story. The hardest questions never come shouting. They arrive quietly, from the side of life, in the middle of some ordinary task. Elijah was nearly 9 when he asked me who he was. It didn't happen during a solemn dinner or some planned conversation. It was a Tuesday, while I was hemming a pair of pants and he was doing homework stretched out on the living room rug. The late afternoon light poured in crooked through the window, gilding the floor like some old promise. He looked up at me with that expression only children have, a mix of curiosity and a hunger to belong, and said, "Mom, what am I?" I let go of the thread, let the needle slip slowly from my fingers, and waited for him to say more. But he didn't, just kept looking at me like he was waiting for a bridge to form between two shores. I understood. I understood because that "what" was more than a question. It was absence. It was a kind of emotional history he carried in his body without knowing how to name it. I took a deep breath, looked up at the crucifix above the door, then back at him. I couldn't answer right away. Because how do you answer that? How do you tell a child that half of him came from someone who died before ever seeing what he'd planted? How do you explain that the father he might imagine having adventures with had only existed for the length of a single peaceful night? I wanted to tell him everything, with tenderness, with patience. But I also wanted to shield him from the harshness of the truth. So, like so many mothers do, I hid inside her simplicity. "You're my son. That's what you are." He scrunched his face. "But what about the rest? Am I like the other boys? Because at school, they asked where my skin came from, my hair. Said I looked different. That maybe my dad was from somewhere else. Was he? He was. But the somewhere else he carried wasn't a place on a map. It was history. It was the part of the war that still hadn't ended. The part that left invisible scars. Elijah was made of a mixture people didn't know how to read without discomfort. He had my features, yes, but also the tone of a voice that wasn't mine. A way of walking that mirrored someone he'd never seen. An intensity in his gaze from someone who never got to leave him a message. That night, after he'd fallen asleep, I sat next to the box, ran my hand across the lid and thought, maybe it's time. Maybe he deserves to know. But how do you tell a child a war story when he still dreams of paper airplanes? How do you translate a letter that never arrived, a love that lasted no longer than a storm, a silence that shadowed me for years? I waited a little longer, waited for the right moment, if such a thing exists, and it did come. It came on a Sunday morning when Elijah was 12 and brought home a school genealogy project. He sat at the table, opened his notebook, and said, "Mom, I need to know more about my dad. Full name, where he was born, if he fought in the war. What should have been just a school task became a landslide inside me. That thing I'd been putting off for years was now staring me down with a due date. That night, after I'd washed the dishes and folded the laundry, I called him over to the couch, took his hand, and asked him to listen with his heart. I told him. Not everything, but enough. I told him his father's name was James Eli Turner. That he was a good man with a beautiful voice who knew how to listen to silence and used to sing before missions. I told him James was a soldier, yes, but more than that, he was kind, that he loved me with his eyes and his care, that we danced together without music, that we shared bread and fear, and that he died not knowing he'd left behind something even braver in the world, his son. Elijah looked at me in silence. He didn't cry. He didn't question. He just leaned in slowly, rested his head on my shoulder, and said, "Thanks for choosing me." And that broke me open, because I was the one who should have been grateful, for him choosing me to come into the world, for giving me a reason to go on. The next day I gave him the box, for the first time. He opened it carefully, like he already sensed there was more than just things inside. He touched the pin, the letter, the photograph. Stayed quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I look like him." And I answered, "You are him, and more. You're what he left as a dream, and what I had to find as courage." Over time, Elijah started using his father's name in school projects. Sometimes he spoke about him like he knew him. And in a way, he did. Because legacy isn't just what gets passed on in a will. It's what gets sewn into the body of whoever comes next. And he carried James in his smile, in the way he walked, in the honest way he treated people. Sometimes I'd catch him standing in front of the mirror, looking at himself like he was trying to see someone beyond the reflection. And I let him, because he had the right. Years later, when he got accepted to college, he filled out his application and wrote, "Father, James Eli Turner, fallen soldier in Hawaii, present in my story." I read that with blurred eyes, because he had done what I never could. He gave his father a place in the world, made his name heard, seen, accepted. Looking back now, I realize my son didn't ask who he was out of simple curiosity. He asked because he needed anchoring. He needed to know where he came from to figure out who he could become. And I, even trembling, became that bridge. A bridge made of unsent letters, sleepless nights, and a war story that turned into living legacy. And even if the world still looked at him with confusion, he knew. He knew where he came from. He knew who he was. He knew what ran in his blood. And that was always enough. Some rituals don't need an audience. They don't require flowers or speeches, or even names carved in marble. Sometimes all it takes is presence. A silence that lingers. A private gesture no one else would understand. That's how the only ceremony for my son's father happened. No name on the headstone. No witnesses, no sound. Just me, Elijah, and the wind whistling through the pines of a forgotten military base. It all started with a question from him, as always. Elijah was already a grown man, studying history and interning at a small local museum. One day he came home with a more serious look than usual. "Mom, I found a record. A James E. Turner, 302nd Fighter Group. Missing in action in 1944. The base matches. The dates match. It's him, isn't it?" I didn't need to answer. The silence that passed between us said enough, he went on. The body was found years later. He's buried in Section 4 at Arlington Cemetery, but the ID is incomplete. Did you know? I nodded slowly. I knew. Of course I knew. But I never told him. Never took my son there. Maybe out of fear. Maybe out of respect, or maybe because some part of me believed that if I never stepped on that ground, I could still pretend James was somewhere else in the world, whole. But Elijah didn't let it go. He took my hand, looked me in the eyes, and said, "I want to meet my father, even if he never got to meet me." We went 2 days later. The drive was quiet. He drove carefully while I stared out the window, feeling the weight of every mile, as if it were part of a journey that had started decades before. When the car stopped at the iron gates, a warm breeze came through the window. I caught the smell of freshly cut grass, and old memories rose in my throat. Arlington was everything I feared, and more. A vast expanse of white headstones, lined up like soldiers at rest, each one a world of stories buried beneath it. We walked slowly. Elijah read the names, brushed his fingers across the marble. When we reached Section 4, he stopped, took a deep breath and pointed to a plain headstone, unadorned with no flowers, and a name carved small. J. E. Turner, 332nd FG, 1944. My knees buckled, but I didn't cry. I knelt beside the stone, ran my hand across the name like I was touching his face for the first time in years. Elijah stood silently, as if he knew that moment belonged to me. Only me. I murmured a prayer, said things I had carried for decades, apologized for not writing another letter, for hiding Elijah for so long, for not being brave enough to tell the world what he meant to me. Then I pulled from my pocket a folded handkerchief with the bird-shaped pin inside, the one he used to wear on his collar, and left it at the base of the headstone. "Now you can fly again," I whispered. Elijah knelt beside me, touched the stone too. Then he pulled a small frame from his coat. Inside, a photo of us, him as a child, laughing in my lap, head thrown back in joy. He leaned it against the corner of the headstone. "This is me, Dad, and that's her. Thank you for giving me the missing half. It was the most beautiful ceremony I've ever witnessed. There were no flowers, but there was ancestry. No priest, but there was blessing. No anthem, but there was justice. A quiet, poetic justice that didn't need applause. It was ours. A silent reunion between what was lost and what remained." On the way back, Elijah drove differently. I could tell. Something in him had settled. A peace inside finally found its place. When we stopped at a roadside diner, he stirred his coffee and said, "Now I understand myself better. Not because I found out who he was, but because I saw with my own eyes that he existed, that he had a name, a place, a grave, and that he loved." Back in Vermont, I tucked the visitor receipt into an envelope, along with the scribbled letter and the folded photo. The box went back to its corner, now with one new piece of paper inside. A copy of the burial record. The war story that had followed me all these years finally had a resolution. Not an ending, because stories like this don't truly end, but a resting point. A place where memory can sit and breathe. Now, sometimes I look up at the sky and wonder. Maybe he saw, maybe James felt, from wherever he is, that we were there, that we didn't forget, that the love that barely had time to exist continued all these years in care, in silence, in the living story Elijah carries in his bones and soul. And even without a full name on the stone, he has a name in the world now. He has a son who knows. He has a legacy that breathes. It didn't happen through a grand gesture. No speeches, no tributes, no dramatic revelations. It was a brief sentence, dropped casually by someone who had no idea how heavy those words would land. But in that moment, in that ordinary room, between two worn-out chairs and a lukewarm coffee forgotten on the table, I knew everything had come full circle. That my son, the one born without a father's name between convent walls and veils of silence, was now also heir to a name, a history, and a gaze that didn't come from me alone. Elijah was visiting me at the nursing home, like he did every Sunday. He always sat in the armchair by the window, kicked off his shoes, stretched his legs, and stared at the stained glass chapel beyond the courtyard. Sometimes he brought cornbread, sometimes old newspapers. But always, without fail, he brought patience. A rare kind of patience like his father's, or maybe just his own. That day he came with a notebook full of scribbles, names, and dates. He said he was working on a project for a small digital memorial, honoring African American soldiers forgotten by official tributes. Mom, so many people died without ever being remembered. I thought maybe I could help bring some of them back, even if it's just in pixels. I sat in silence for a moment, looked at him, at the man he had become. Tall, soft-spoken, eyes steady without being sharp. He carried the strength of someone who had to build his own ground, without losing his gentleness. As he spoke about his research and the interviews he'd been doing, I caught a glimpse in the window's reflection, a shape I knew well. That tilt of the head when he listened, the way he held the notebook, pressing both thumbs into the corners, the pause between sentences, leaving space for the world to breathe. That was James, not in looks, but in essence. A new caregiver walked into the room to collect the cups. She stopped, smiled at us, and said, "He's got your eyes, you know. It's beautiful to see that kind of resemblance." Before I could say a word, Elijah, still gazing out the window, replied, "Actually, they're his." The caregiver frowned slightly, confused. I just smiled, because I understood, and that was enough. After she left, Elijah looked at me with a kind of ancient calm. "Mom, you gave me more than life. You gave me identity. You gave me space to become. And even when you were protecting me from the world, you never denied me who I was. I didn't grow up with his name on my documents, but I grew up with the dignity you protected like treasure. That undid me, because most of my life had been about holding in tears, truth, body, questions. I was raised to be useful, not to disturb. To be a nurse, a caretaker, a quiet woman. I was trained, Anna, to erase myself, but in that moment, in that gentle voice of my son, I realized my silence had held value too, that somehow he had understood everything, even what I never said aloud, and that now, at almost 40, he saw me fully, as a mother, as a woman, as the living memory of a man history refused to keep, but whom we never let go. Sometimes I think that's how emotional stories survive. In small gestures, in offhand comments, in boxes that resist time, in photos that fade but still speak. That day when he called me a mother with his eyes, it wasn't just a metaphor. It was a rite of passage, a quiet recognition of everything that had been lost and reclaimed. Before he left, he hugged me the way he always did. But that afternoon, he held on a little longer, rested his head on my shoulder, just like when he was small, then whispered, "Some people think blood makes legacy, but I think it's care. And you cared for our story, Mom, even when it didn't know if it wanted to exist." I sat there a while after he left. The old radio in the corner of the room still worked, though static buzzed between stations. I turned the dial slowly until I found a soft blues instrumental, the kind of music that seems to speak to the parts of you no one else sees. I let it play, closed my eyes, imagined James sitting in the cockpit, whispering that same melody before a mission. Imagined baby Elijah, listening from his crib. Imagined the two of them meeting inside my thoughts, and I let myself feel, truly, that yes, now we were all in the same place, inside a story that, even with its gaps, had finally been completed by love. Because love even when silenced, doesn't disappear. It transforms into presence, into legacy, into eyes that look with the same tenderness. And that day, when they called me a mother with his eyes, I knew. The war had ended. The silence had rested. And the story, at last, had found peace. Silence has always been my most fluent language. I was taught to speak little, to lower my eyes, to swallow my tears and keep moving, like so many women of my generation. But inside me, there's always been a story. A war story, a love story, a story of loss. And now, for the first time, I let myself tell it fully, even if in pieces. Because the truth is, some secrets aren't kept out of shame. They're kept out of love. And love, when it's too big, sometimes needs a whole life to find the right time to bloom. For me, it bloomed late, in my son's eyes, in the blues that played again on the radio, in the photograph that now rests on the shelf beside a lit candle, and in the way Elijah holds my hand every time he visits this room with stained glass. Sometimes I still wake in the middle of the night with the feeling that James will walk through that door, not as a ghost, but as a memory. And he does. In Elijah's features, in the lavender scent on the handkerchief I keep in the drawer, in the sound of rain tapping the window, just like it did in the infirmary that night when everything went silent. He enters quietly, and I let him, because now I don't have to forget to survive. Now I can remember to exist. If you've listened to my story this far, thank you. Not just for listening, but for letting it live inside you too. Sometimes we carry secrets for so long, we forget that all they need is a sincere ear to stop being wounds and become bridges. This was mine, my crossing, my whisper held for decades, my emotional story, my son, my silence, my war. If something in me touched something in you, tell me in the comments. Tell me if you've ever carried a hidden love in your chest, if you've ever kept a box no one else knew about. And if this story made sense to you, share it with someone else who might need to remember that love, even in silence, is still love, that a war story can in fact end in tenderness, and that sometimes being called a mother with his eyes is the most beautiful thing time can give back. Subscribe, stay close, come back often, because on this channel, every forgotten story finds a place to be heard. And thank you for staying with me until the end.